The crate manifest for Kilozam Way Station, Docking Bay 11, run date the 14th of the Quorathi administrative calendar, which I still have to convert in my head every time, because the Quorathi have 17 months and their 7th month has 41 days and nobody has ever satisfactorily explained why. Listed 462 items across 9 categories, none of them interesting. Reclaimed hull plating, grade 2. Atmospheric scrubber cores, partial cartons. Pressure seal compound, 60-kilo drums. Synthetic insulation bat, compressed rolls. Navigation transponder housings, mixed manufacture. Drive coolant, sealed. Cable conduit, assorted diameter. Ferrous fastener assortment, bulk. Miscellaneous salvage, unbonded. The miscellaneous salvage category is where the work actually is. Miscellaneous salvage means nobody loaded this thing with any particular care, which means by the time it arrives at a transit way station after 3 relay jumps through corridors where the cargo handling ranges from perfunctory to actively hostile, what was listed as miscellaneous salvage has become a compressed argument between inertia and incompetence. Items migrate. Items nest inside other items. Items that were sealed are no longer sealed. Items that were labeled are no longer labeled, the labels having been liberated by vibration and redistributed throughout the container as small rectangular confetti. You open a crate of miscellaneous salvage expecting 47 items, and you find 39 items, and one of them is something you have never seen before in your life and cannot identify and will not be able to bill for. I had a stylus in one hand and a battered scanner in the other, and I was on item 214 when the hailing tone sounded on the bay comm. I noted the tone. I noted that it had the particular pitch modulation the Quorathi use for formal government channels, which is a pitch modulation I associate with paperwork, fees, permits, inspections, and other forms of structured inconvenience. I continued my count. 215. 216. I was in the middle of trying to determine whether the object in my hand was a navigation transponder housing or a pressure valve cover that had migrated from another crate entirely. And this was a genuinely important distinction, because transponder housings bill at a different rate, and I was already going to have a rounding dispute with the consignment broker at Kilo's station proper when I delivered. And I did not want to introduce additional ambiguity into what was already an ambiguous load. The hailing tone sounded again. I set the object in question in the to-be-determined pile, 217. The third time, it was accompanied by a text flag on my wrist unit. Priority communication, Quorathi enforcement arm, forward operations command, respond immediately. I noted this as well. I finished the row I was in. I was not being obstinate. I was being precise. You lose your count in a miscellaneous salvage manifest, and you are redoing the last 40 items, because that is the only honest way to rebuild an accurate tally once you're uncertain where your error crept in. I have been doing this work for 11 years. I do not redo the last 40 items if I can avoid it. I got to a natural stopping point, end of a subcategory, the insulation bats, and I set the scanner down on top of a crate and answered the channel. The face that appeared on the bay comm screen was gray-mottled, broad, with the flat-pupiled pale eyes the Quorathi carry in the senior officer caste. 4 secondary eye stalks, each one currently oriented fully toward the pickup, which is their version of undivided attention. The neck frills were fanned, brick-colored at the roots, fading to pale yellow at the tips, elevated but not fully displayed, which in Quorathi body language sits somewhere between formal authority and controlled irritation. He wore the dark-banded command collar of the Enforcement Arm's Forward Operations Tier, which is the branch that handles border approach corridors, contraband interdiction, and the general business of making life difficult for independent cargo runners in contested transit zones. He had the look of an officer who had given this particular opening speech before, many times, and found the weight of repetition reassuring rather than tiresome. The look of a man who believes that procedure, practiced often enough, becomes certainty. "Civilian vessel," he said. He had a voice like something being folded under pressure. "You are in violation of Quorathi Enforcement Arm Emergency Directive 774, which establishes a restricted approach corridor around the Kilo Zamwe station cluster effective from this cycle's second interval. You are required to stand down all operations, cease cargo movement, and prepare for inspection and possible impoundment. Acknowledge." I looked at him. Then I looked at the bay around me, the stacked crates, the organized piles, the to-be-determined pile, the 247 items I had not yet counted. Then I looked back at him. "I'm docked," I said. He blinked with two of his 4 secondary eyes, which is a micro-expression I have learned to read as recalibration. They received an input that did not match the expected response, and they are briefly adjusting. "You are in a restricted approach corridor." "I've been docked in Bay 11 for 3 days," I said. "I arrived on the 11th. Registered under Marin Soli's vessel Garrett's Margin, independent cargo and salvage out of Delos Transit. I have a docking receipt. I can send it to you if you want it." The neck frills moved. Not a full display, but a shift, lateral fanning, which is uncertainty combined with ongoing authority assertion. The directive applies retroactively to all vessels currently occupying the restricted zone. I considered this, does it? The Quorathi Enforcement Arm has operational authority over this corridor. You will acknowledge the directive and stand down all operations. "I'm counting a salvage manifest," I said. "I've been counting it for 6 hours. I'm on item 217. Standing down operations at this point means starting again from item 1, and I'm not going to do that." There was a silence. It was a silence of the particular texture that occurs when an authority figure has issued a clear command and received a response that is neither compliance nor defiance but something orthogonal to both, and has not yet determined which category of reaction is appropriate. I have some experience generating this kind of silence. I do not generate it intentionally. It is simply what happens when the thing I am actually doing does not map cleanly onto what someone else was expecting me to be doing. "You are required to acknowledge the directive," he said again. "I heard it," I said. "I'm not in an approach corridor, I'm in a docking bay. My vessel is stationary. I'm not approaching anything. I'm counting insulation bats. Do you want the docking receipt or not?" He did not answer the question about the docking receipt. He closed the channel. I picked up my scanner, 218. The second contact came 40 minutes later, which is an interestingly long gap when you consider that the Quorathi Enforcement Arm runs forward operations on a tight interval protocol. 40 minutes means someone was having a conversation about me. I do not have a particular view about being the subject of conversations I'm not part of, except that in my experience, when a government enforcement body spends 40 minutes discussing an independent cargo runner who told them she was counting insulation bats, the conversation tends to be about jurisdiction, procedure, and face, in roughly that order. The enforcement arm's forward operations command runs on a command model I have come to understand fairly well over 6 years in their administrative zone. The fleet commander at the top of the chain is the decision authority for operational matters, but he is surrounded by a staff of tactical and administrative coordinators whose job is to translate his decisions into executable actions, and where the situation is ambiguous, to provide him with options that fit within the zone's formal procedure. The problem with ambiguous situations is that the staff's options tend to be drawn from a menu that was designed for situations that were not ambiguous. They are very good at compliance. They are very good at defiance. They have excellent procedures for both. A situation that is neither compliance nor defiance tends to get routed through the compliance procedure, because that is the more optimistic interpretation. until enough data accumulates to push it into the defiance procedure, which is the less optimistic one. The 40-minute gap was the time it took for that routing decision to complete. I was on item 304 when the second channel opened. Same face. The neck frills were fully displayed now, all 4 secondary eye stalks trained on the pickup, full brick red at the roots, the pale yellow tips rigid and spread. This is the full authority display, which the Quorathi reserve for situations where they have decided the matter is not ambiguous and they are done discussing it. "Civilian vessel Garrett's Margin," he said. "You have been identified as operating from a Deathworld classification system. This identification has been logged with Enforcement Arm Command and with the Kilo's Regional Authority. You are hereby ordered to stand down all operations immediately and submit to inspection. Non-compliance will be treated as active obstruction of Enforcement Arm operations. Acknowledge this directive." I had been waiting for this loosely. Not because I expected it. I genuinely had not been planning for it, which is perhaps a character flaw. But the manifest had my full attention, and I find it difficult to preoccupy myself with hypotheticals when there is concrete counting to be done. But because once a Quorathi officer closes a channel without getting compliance and spends 40 minutes in a conversation, and then reopens with the full authority display, the Deathworld identification is the move they reach for. It is the move that, in their experience, changes the dynamic. It is the move that is supposed to introduce a variable they believe they understand. Human, ergo dangerous, ergo now we have established who has the power and who should be afraid. I have been a Class 9 national my entire life. I was born on a planet that the Quorathi classification system rates as Class 9, which means it is, by their index, 9 gradations above the median galactic habitability threshold. Gravity on the high end of comfortable. Atmospheric pressure requiring adaptation. Native fauna in the upper predator tiers. A rotational day of 22 hours. An axial tilt that produces seasonal temperature swings of 80 degrees. The place where I grew up was in the temperate band, which is the manageable part, and I spent the first 22 years of my life there without thinking of it as anything in particular. It was where I was from. The ground was firm. The weather was variable. The local wildlife respected you if you respected it, and did not respect you if you did not, which is a property I have since observed in most things worth taking seriously. The Quorathi think of Class 9 as a number. I think of it as a place where the ground is firm, and the winters run long, and you learn early that finishing what you started is the only reliable protection against the cold. I pulled up the docking registry confirmation on my wrist unit, not because I needed to see it, but because I was going to read something from it, and I prefer to be accurate when I read things aloud. "My Deathworld classification is in my transit papers," I said. "Filed with Kilo Station arrivals on the 11th. You have my registration. I'm listed as a Class 9 Origin World National." That's standard intake paperwork. I'm not sure why you're reading it back to me as though it's new information. "The enforcement arm is aware of your classification," he said. The voice was doing something I recognized. It had acquired a particular quality of deliberateness, each word placed with care, that in a Quorathi officer of this rank indicates they have decided to treat this as a formal escalation sequence, and they are now proceeding through it by protocol. "You will acknowledge the directive." "I acknowledged hearing it on the first call," I said. "I told you I heard it. Acknowledgement of receipt is different from compliance, and I'm not sure the directive actually applies to me because I'm docked. But if you want to send me the specific statutory language, I'll read it. I have some time. You will prepare for inspection and possible impoundment." "I've been docked for 3 days," I said. "I have a waystation license, a cargo bond, and a current transit permit. I've paid my docking fees. I have an appointment to deliver this manifest to the Kilo Station consignment broker on the 17th. If you want to inspect my vessel and my cargo, I'll need to be present for the inspection, and I need to finish this count first, because my delivery bond requires a signed count verification, and I'm not breaking the chain of custody on a cargo bond for an inspection that hasn't been formally filed with station arrivals. I was not making any of that up. I was making up the word chain of custody slightly. Cargo bonds don't technically use that phrasing, but the underlying requirement was real. A signed count verification is a real thing. I did need it. I just also needed it to be done before I was going to agree to anything, which I had needed before any of this started and was going to need after it finished. You have 47 minutes to stand down and prepare for inspection, the fleet commander said. My name is Marin Solis, I said. If you're going to file a formal enforcement action, you'll need my name spelled correctly for the paperwork. Marin Solis, Soliqs, with an accent on the I. I say this because Quorathi administrative records have a consistent problem with human diacritical marks, and I've had fines sent to the wrong person before. He closed the channel. I went back to item 305. There is something worth understanding about a Quorathi fleet commander in a contested border corridor who has issued a formal directive to a stationary cargo runner and received, on two separate contacts, neither compliance nor defiance, but the particular flat response of someone who is occupied with something else. I am not a student of Quorathi psychology, but I have been working transit corridors in their operational zones for 6 years, and in that time, I have developed a working model of how they respond to this particular dynamic. They do not understand it. This is the core of it. Their command structure is hierarchical and formal, and they genuinely believe, not as arrogance but as bedrock assumption, that rank and authority produce compliance. Not because they have tested this and found it reliable, but because it is the organizing principle of their civilization. The idea that formal power, properly asserted, resolves ambiguous situations. When a Quorathi officer of Fleet Command rank issues an enforcement arm directive, they expect one of two responses, compliance or defiance. Compliance closes the matter. Defiance opens a formal escalation sequence that they are very good at. What they do not have a protocol for is the third option, which is, the party being addressed is busy and is not particularly worried about the directive and will get to it when she gets to it. This reads to them, I think, as a kind of malfunction, not as a hostile act, not as deliberate defiance, but as a failure mode, as though my communication equipment is faulty, or my translation matrix is imperfect, or there is some process error that is producing this aberrant response. They keep sending the signal because the correct response hasn't been received yet, and they believe that the correct response will eventually arrive once the error is corrected. What they do not generally consider is that the error is not on my end. I found the item I could not identify earlier in the to-be-determined pile. I spent 4 minutes with it. I confirmed it was, in fact, a pressure valve cover and not a transponder housing, which was going to save me an argument with the consignment broker and cost me approximately 12 credits in revised billing, which is a net positive outcome. I moved it to the correct category. I continued my count. The third contact came at item 389. Different face this time. Junior officer from the collar rank, a tactical coordinator, I thought, from the Enforcement Arms Boarding Operations Division. Smaller frills, brighter coloring, the high-energy saturation you see in younger Quorathi who have not yet had the color burned out of them by administrative responsibility. He looked like he was reading from a prepared statement, and the statement had been prepared by someone who had decided that the time for soft approaches was over. Civilian vessel Garrett's Margin. This is Tactical Coordinator Shenvalos of the Quorathi Enforcement Arm Forward Operations Wing, Kilo's Approach Corridor. You have been unresponsive to 3 separate enforcement arm directives. This is notice that the Forward Operations Wing has received authorization to initiate a boarding approach on your vessel. You will unlock your docking bay inner seal and prepare to receive a 6-member inspection team. Non-compliance will result in forced entry. You have 30 minutes to comply. Acknowledge." "I'm in the middle of a cargo count," I said. Shenvalos blinked, all 4 secondaries oriented to the pickup. He paused, looked briefly to his right, which means he was getting a prompt from someone off-screen, probably Fleet Commander Vethasar. He looked back. "You are required to comply with this directive." "I know," I said. "I heard the directive. I've heard all 3 of them. I'm going to finish my count, and then I'm going to close the cargo bay, and then I'm going to deal with the paperwork for this inspection. It's going to take me about 40 minutes. "You have 30 minutes. "Then you're going to need to wait 10 minutes more than you allocated," I said. "I'm not leaving an unsigned manifest in a cargo bay. That's not a Deathworlder thing or an enforcement arm thing. It's a cargo bond thing, and it predates both of us." Off-screen prompt again. Shenvalos looked back with the expression of someone who has been given an instruction they find personally embarrassing to deliver. "Commander Vethasar requests that you confirm your Deathworld classification." "Class 9 Origin World," I said. "It's in my transit papers. It's been in my transit papers since the 11th. It hasn't changed since the 11th. I don't know why this is the 3rd time someone from your command has asked me about it." "The commander wants your verbal confirmation." I thought about this for a moment. I understood what was happening. The verbal confirmation was not about the information. They had the information. They had had it since the first call. The verbal confirmation was about establishing the frame. A Class 9 Origin World National, verbally acknowledging her classification on a formal command channel to a fleet rank officer. It was about who was smaller in the frame. An officer who could get a human to say her classification on a recorded channel, with the enforcement arm watching, had demonstrated something, had reasserted the hierarchy that my inattentive responses had quietly been declining to confirm. "Class 9, I said. "Marin Solis, Class 9 National Independent Cargo Runner, Vessel Garrett's Margin, currently docked in Bay 11 of Kilo Zomway Station and counting insulation bats. Is there anything else you need verbally confirmed, or can I go back to work?" Shenvalos closed the channel. I went back to item 390. I want to be honest about something, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I was not playing a game with the Quorathi fleet commander. I was not running a strategy. I was not performing some calibrated psychological operation designed to unsettle him through the specific technique of appearing to be unconcerned. I was unconcerned. The count genuinely needed finishing. The cargo bond genuinely required a signed verification. The inspection was probably going to happen, and was probably going to be annoying, and was going to require me to stand in my own cargo bay for somewhere between 2 and 4 hours, while Quorathi boarding officers moved my organized piles into disorganized piles, and confirmed that I was, in fact, a cargo runner with a cargo of salvage, and not whatever it was they were actually worried about in this corridor. That was the sum total of my planning. The thing that the Quorathi enforcement arm had not factored into their planning, and I want to be clear that this was not something I was counting on. It was something I had simply done as routine logistics procedure 3 days earlier, and had not bothered to undo, was Waystation Kilo Zom's automated cargo protection grid. Kilo Zom is an old waystation. Pre-Quorathi administrative zone old, which means pre-standardization, which means it was built by a consortium of independent transit operators who were not particularly interested in being subject to anyone else's jurisdiction, and had therefore built the station's operational architecture with a specific set of assumptions about who was authorized to board what cargo and when. The cargo protection grid is part of that architecture. It is not a weapons system, exactly. It is classified under transit law as a cargo integrity enforcement mechanism. But it has a similar functional profile, because the people who built this station were practical-minded and believed that integrity was most effectively enforced through consequences. The grid draws from the station's own power infrastructure, operates on independent hardware that predates the administrative zone's integration protocols, and responds to unauthorized access attempts with the unhurried confidence of a system that was built before anyone thought to ask its permission. When you register cargo at Kilo Zom, you have the option of flagging your docking bay under the cargo protection grid. Most people do not do this, because most people are making short layovers and the registration requires a form, and the form requires a deposit, and it all takes about 45 minutes. I had done it on the 11th because I was making a 3-day layover with a full cargo bond on an unsecured salvage load, and I did not want anyone walking off with my miscellaneous salvage while I was sleeping. It is the kind of thing that takes 45 minutes to set up, and then takes about 90 seconds to cancel when you're leaving. I had not canceled it because I had not left yet. The grid registration is keyed to my vessel ID. If any vessel or boarding party attempts to access Bay 11 without a confirmed release code from me, the grid activates. The activation does not involve any decision-making on my part. It is automated. It happens the way a smoke alarm happens, not because anyone decided anything, but because a sensor registered a condition and a mechanism responded. The mechanism, in this case, involves a series of hardened emitter arrays positioned along the approach corridor to Bay 11, calibrated to the Transit Authority's standard interdiction specifications, which are the specifications that were standard before the administrative zone arrived and decided it had better ones. I finished item 462 at the 26-minute mark of the boarding party's 30-minute window. I ran the final tally: 462 items confirmed, 3 items reclassified from miscellaneous to specific categories, net billing adjustment, plus 38 credits. I signed the verification, I dated it, I saved it to the cargo bond record. I closed the cargo bay door. I walked to the small galley on Garrett's margin and poured myself a cup of coffee from the pot that had been sitting since that morning, and was technically not at an optimal temperature, but was still, by any reasonable standard, coffee. I sat down. On the bay comm, audible through the vessel's internal speakers at low volume, which I keep on as background, I could hear the Quorathi boarding party's approach vector transmissions. 6 personnel in 2 of the enforcement arm's standard boarding shuttles. They were coming in on the docking approach corridor for Bay 11, coordinated and professional, running by the numbers. Shenvalos was directing the approach, his voice clipped and precise, giving bearing corrections in the flat procedural cadence of someone executing a plan that has already been approved at every necessary level. Fleet Commander Vethasar was on the fleet channel, not the approach channel, which meant he was monitoring but not directing, the appropriate posture for a fleet command officer, managing what he expected to be a routine 6-person boarding action against a stationary cargo runner, who had been, in his assessment, difficult but not capable of anything beyond difficulty. There was a pause in the transmission traffic that lasted about 3 seconds. Then the approach channel lit up with a sound I have learned to recognize, the grid engagement tone. It is a low-pitched cycling sound, very deliberate, like something very old deciding to pay attention. It lasts 4 seconds before the grid goes to active status. In those 4 seconds you can hear everything on the channel stop, not scrambled, not jammed, just stopped, the way a room goes quiet when someone walks in who changes the weight of the air. Shenvalos said something I didn't catch, clipped and sharp. Then he said more clearly, "Fleet Command, we have an automated response from the station grid. Bay 11 is flagged. I'm reading a cargo protection registration. Stand by." "Override it," said Vethasar's voice from the fleet channel, with the compression of a man who has run out of patience and is not interested in new information. Fleet Command, the registration is valid. It's filed to vessel Garrett's margin. The grid is keyed to the vessel owner's release code. We cannot override without the code. The station's pre-zone architecture is running on independent hardware. We don't have integration access. A pause that had a different texture than the earlier ones. Not recalibration, something else. Then get the code, said Vethasar. Fleet Command, the code has to come from the vessel owner voluntarily. Station Administrative Protocol doesn't allow enforcement arm personnel to compel release of a cargo protection code without a court-filed interdiction order. We'd need a station magistrate to get me the civilian on the channel. I heard that. I was drinking my coffee. The fleet channel opened on my vessel speakers. Civilian vessel Garrett's margin. This is Fleet Commander Vethasar of the Quorathi Enforcement Arm. You are required to release the cargo protection grid registration on Bay 11 immediately. The enforcement arm has legal authority to. I keyed the comm. I know, I said. A pause. You will release the grid. I'll release it when I'm done with my coffee, I said. I just finished a 6-hour count. I'm taking 15 minutes. The pause this time was longer. I could hear, very faintly in the background of the fleet channel, the sound of multiple Quorathi officers in a command space reacting to what I had just said. I don't know exactly what those sounds expressed. The Quorathi have a wide acoustic range in their emotional register, and I have not made a systematic study of it. I can say that the sounds were not sounds of calm. You are obstructing an enforcement arm operation, said Vethasar. I'm drinking coffee in my own galley, I said. The grid is a registered cargo protection mechanism. You're trying to board my cargo bay without my permission. I'm not obstructing anything. I'm exercising a transit right that predates your administrative zone designation of this corridor. The grid is doing what I paid it to do. The enforcement arm does not recognize the Kilozam Way Station's pre-zone transit architecture as superseding. I think that's a question for a magistrate, I said. Do you want to file an interdiction order? I'll wait. I'll be here for another 3 days. Silence. Then Shen Valos on the approach channel with a quality I had not heard in his voice before, not the clipped professional cadence of a man running a procedure, but something quieter and more careful. Fleet Command, the grid is at active status. The boarding shuttles are being held at the approach threshold. We cannot proceed without the release code or an interdiction order. Advise. The next 4 minutes I drank my coffee. The communications traffic on the approach channel and the fleet channel, I could hear both at low volume, was a compressed argument I was not part of. I caught fragments. Jurisdictional language, magistrate availability, filing procedures, the name of the regional authority's administrative officer. The word unprecedented used twice by different speakers in close succession, which in my experience means a situation has no established precedent, and people are beginning to reach the point where they have to say so plainly even though nobody wants to be the one to say it first. I heard Shen Valos give a bearing update on the shuttle's holding position. Approach corridor blocked by the active grid, no damage, no incident, simply stopped. I heard someone else, a voice I did not recognize, recommend filing a formal protest with the station registrar regarding the pre-zone architecture's compatibility with current zone boarding protocol. I heard Vethasar say something that I did not catch clearly, but that had the compressed, terminal quality of a decision being made. I finished my coffee, I rinsed the cup, I went back to the bay calm. Okay, I said, addressing the fleet channel. I'm going to release the grid. You can conduct your inspection. I want to be present for the entire inspection. I want a signed copy of the inspection report, and I want it on record that I'm releasing the grid under protest of the directives' applicability to a docked vessel with a valid station license. Do you want to note that on your end, or should I file it separately with the station registrar? A pause that had a particular quality to it, not recalibration, not the earlier uncertainty, but the compressive silence of a command officer deciding how to close a situation that has not gone the way he planned while retaining as much of the original operational frame as possible. The silence of a man who has won something, technically, and knows that he has also lost something, and is deciding which one to acknowledge. "Noted," said Vethasar. "Release the grid." I released the grid. The inspection took 3 hours and 20 minutes. 6 Quorathi enforcement arm officers moved through my cargo bay in a pattern that I observed with the attentive neutrality of someone who has been through this before and knows that attentive neutrality is the best possible posture for it. They were professional. They were thorough. They scanned every crate, pulled samples from 3 of the sealed drums, ran the hull plating through an alloy verification reader. They also, at one point, moved my organized stacks of insulation bat into a formation I can only describe as aspirational, which cost me 40 minutes after they left to restore to something I could work with again. Shenvalos ran the inspection. He was, as I have noted, young, with the bright coloring of a junior officer who has not yet had the ambiguity of the galaxy reduce his expectations to something sustainable. He worked carefully, called each item, had his team scan everything against my verified count. He found no discrepancies, because there were no discrepancies to find. It was salvage. It was all the things I said it was, in roughly the quantities I said they were in, which I knew because I had just spent 6 hours confirming it to my own satisfaction before I would agree to do anything else. I stood where I could see the whole bay, and I kept a running note on my wrist unit of anything that seemed like it would require a follow-up notation in the inspection protest filing. The note stayed short. There was nothing to object to in how they ran the inspection, only in the fact of it. Toward the end, Shenvalos stopped near the pressure seal compound drums and looked at me. The inspection was almost complete. He had a summary form in one hand and a scanning stylus in the other, and the particular expression of a junior officer who has been tasked with something he understood the mechanics of but not the purpose. He looked at me with something quieter than professional neutral, something that was, I thought, closer to the actual question he wanted to ask, the one that the inspection protocol had not given him a category for. "You were counting," he said, "for the entire duration of the approach." "Yes," I said. "The commander believed you were attempting to delay the boarding as a strategic measure." "I needed to finish the count," I said. "Yes." He looked at the drums for a moment, then back at me. "We ran a full tactical assessment of your vessel and the waystation bay, 6 personnel, 2 shuttles, full authorization from Forward Operations Command." He paused. "The grid registration was filed on the 11th. "Standard layover precaution," I said. "I had a full cargo bond on an unsecured load." "You didn't cancel it." "I hadn't left yet." He looked at me, I looked at him. He had the expression of someone who has just confirmed a hypothesis that he had been entertaining for some time, but had not been entirely willing to hold. Someone who had run through the alternative explanations and found them insufficient and arrived, reluctantly but accurately, at the one that remained. "You weren't planning for us," he said. "It was not a question." "I didn't know you were there until the first hail," I said. "I was on item 214. He was quiet for a moment. Then he made a small sound, very low in register, that I think was the Quorathi equivalent of a private acknowledgement, not directed at me, not directed at his team, just an internal adjustment to a model that had been running on certain assumptions and was now running on different ones. He signed the inspection report. He handed me my copy. He led his team out of the bay without looking back. I stood in the bay for a minute after they left, looking at the reorganized stacks. Then I started putting things back where they belonged. Fleet Commander Vethasar did not contact me again directly. I know from the station registrar's log, which I accessed the following morning as part of routine post-inspection paperwork, that the enforcement arm filed 3 administrative documents regarding the Kilozam incident in the 4 hours following the inspection. The first was a jurisdictional query addressed to the Kilos Regional Authority regarding the legal status of pre-zone way station transit architecture under current zone operational directives. The second was an internal incident report, the summary line of which the registrar read to me because she found it noteworthy: unauthorized obstruction, nature unconfirmed. The third was a request for clarification on the enforcement arm's standard procedure for handling cargo protection grid registrations under the pre-zone framework, which is the kind of document that gets filed when a standard procedure has encountered a situation it was not designed to address, and the people operating the procedure would prefer that someone in a higher administrative tier decide what to do about it rather than deciding themselves. None of those documents were addressed to me. None of them required my response. The fleet left the approach corridor at the end of that cycle. The registrar told me they were rerouted to a different sector on standard patrol rotation. I did not track them. I had other things to do. I have been doing this work for 11 years. I started as a deckhand on a mid-range hauler out of the Delos Transit Network, running the standard loops, the Kilos approach, the Brennan corridor, the long haul out to the Saravathi relay stations and back. I got my own ticket 7 years ago, bought Garrett's margin from a retiring cargo runner who had gotten tired of the Quorathi administrative zone expansion and wanted to spend her remaining years on a planet that did not require her to refile her transit permits every 16 months. Her name was Garrett. The margin is what she called the difference between what the job looks like from the outside and what it actually is, which is mostly counting. She taught me the cargo bond system before she handed over the keys. She sat me down in Garrett's margin's small galley, the same galley where I later drank my coffee while a fleet commander waited, and she went through the system item by item, the way she went through everything, methodically, with the expectation that I would pay attention and retain it, without particular concern for whether I found it interesting. She taught me the count verification protocol. She taught me about the pre-zone way station architecture and why it matters and why you should always read the fine print on a docking registration before you sign off on it, because the fine print is frequently where the actual protections live. The zone is recent, she said once, about the Quorathi administrative zone, which was, at the time, still expanding into the corridor she had been running for 20 years. The stations are old. Old things have already worked out what they need to survive. Newer things are still deciding. She would have found the Kilozam incident unsurprising. She would not have found it entertaining. She would have found it illustrative in the way that she found most things that confirmed a principle she had already established. She would have made a note of the specific grid registration details and added them to the transit reference folder. Then she would have gone back to work. I make decent money. Not exceptional money, but decent. I run clean cargo, mostly salvage, some bulk materials, occasional specialty equipment when someone needs something moved carefully. I have a good working relationship with the consignment broker at Kilos Station proper, who is a four-armed scholarly type with a methodical temperament and a deep personal investment in accurate billing, which I respect. I have a functional vessel, a current transit permit, a cargo bond, and a docking license at 4 way stations that I use regularly. I'm not remarkable in the way that the Quorathi enforcement arm apparently expected a Class 9 national to be remarkable. I do not have weapons on my vessel. I do not have advanced tactical systems. I did not, in the incident with Fleet Commander Vethasar, do anything that could be described as a tactical operation by any standard that holds up to scrutiny. I counted cargo. I drank coffee. I released the grid when I was done with my coffee. I was present for a routine inspection. I filed a protest note with the station registrar. This is not, to my mind, a story about what Class 9 nationals can do. It is a story about what happens when a fleet commander builds his operational frame around a variable He thinks he understands, and the variable turns out to be doing something else entirely. Here is the part that I think about. Sometimes, in the evenings on long hauls when there is nothing to do but run the nav checks and let the drive do its work. Vethasar ran a tactical assessment. His team ran threat analysis. They pulled my transit papers, confirmed my classification, ran the Garrett's margin through the Enforcement Arms Vessel Registry, assembled an approach team, drafted the approach protocol, secured the authorization, filed the paperwork. They spent time. They spent fuel. They spent the attention of 6 trained personnel and a fleet command officer. They had a plan that, at every stage of its construction, was based on a model of the person they were dealing with. And what they encountered was a woman who was on item 214 and did not want to lose her count. I do not think this is funny. I am aware that it reads that way, and I do not object to that reading, but what I actually feel about it is something quieter than funny. There is a thing that happens in transit corridors, in the contested zones and the pre-zone way stations and the border approaches, where someone with formal authority looks at someone without formal authority and builds a model of that person based on what they believe that person is. The model is confident. The model is detailed. The model has been tested many times and found reliable in most circumstances. The model contains assumptions that have, until that point, been sound. And then the person without formal authority is just doing something that the model did not account for, not as a strategy, not as a performance, just because that was what needed to be done, and she had been doing it for 6 hours before they arrived, and she was going to be done with it before she stopped. The model does not know what to do with this. The model was built for compliance or defiance. It does not have a category for busy. It does not have a protocol for she'll get to it when she gets to it. It does not contain the variable that a cargo runner from a Class 9 world who has been counting salvage for 6 hours and is on item 214 has a very specific relationship with finishing what she started, one that does not yield to formal authority, not because she is defying formal authority, but because the count is the count, and the count does not care what formal authority wants. I find this interesting. I have found it interesting for 11 years. It does not get less interesting. There is a related thing, which I have also had time to consider. The Quorathi enforcement arm is good at what it does. Vethasar was not an incompetent officer running a sloppy operation. He was a competent officer running a correct operation against a set of assumptions that turned out to be wrong. The assumptions were wrong not because they were poorly made, but because they were made about a Class 9 national using the Quorathi's model of what a Class 9 national is, and that model is built on a kind of knowledge that is wide but not deep. They know the classification. They know the parameters. They know what the parameters imply about physical capability, about environmental tolerance, about threat profile. What they don't always know, what Vethasar did not know, and what Shenvalos began to figure out somewhere in the middle of the inspection, is that the classification is a description of the place, not the person. The person is someone who grew up in that place and learned from it the specific things that place teaches. The place I grew up taught long winters and firm ground and finishing what you start. That is not a weapon. It is just how things get done. The fleet commander's model had a slot for threat. It did not have a slot for competence that was pointed at a cargo manifest and not at him. It did not have a slot for a person whose first concern, on receiving a priority communication from a Quorathi fleet officer, was not the fleet officer but the to-be-determined pile. There is a way station on the Brennan corridor called Thessamory, which is older than Kilo Zom and in considerably worse structural condition, but has, in my experience, the best cargo bond processing of any independent station on the eastern approach routes. The registrar there is a cephalopod of a different subspecies than Vethasar, smaller, lighter colored, with vestigial frills that she keeps tucked at all times, which in her subspecies indicates a temperament that prefers precision to display. Her name is Arovi Kem. She has been running the Thessamery Registrar's desk for, by her account, 32 years, which means she has been running it since before the Quorathi administrative zone reached the Brennan corridor, and she has opinions about this that she shares when she considers it relevant, which is more often than you might expect from someone who otherwise keeps her frills tucked. She told me, the first time I used her station, that the reason she stayed when the administrative zone arrived was that the enforcement arm never figured out how to integrate pre-zone registrar systems into their standard protocol. The integration project got as far as a compatibility assessment, and then stalled on a series of technical incompatibilities that nobody in the administrative zone's technical branch had the historical context to resolve. The project was filed as pending. Arovi Chem had been listed as the point of contact for the integration for 32 years. Nobody had contacted her. She said this with the particular satisfaction of someone describing a lasting bureaucratic victory that has required no active effort on her part to maintain. Only the patience of a system that was built to last and an administrative zone that had more integration projects than it had resources to complete them. She keeps a copy of the original Thessamery Charter, the founding document of the station, pre-zone, written in 4 languages including one that is no longer in common use, on the wall behind her desk, in a frame, under a small light that runs on its own dedicated power cell. The power cell is independent of the station's main grid. She had it installed when the administrative zone first arrived, as a precaution. The zone, she told me once, is very good at accounting for things that fit its framework. It is not good at accounting for things that were built before the framework existed. I asked her if that ever caused problems. For them, she said, frequently. On the 17th, I delivered the manifest to the consignment broker at Kilo's station proper. He reviewed the count verification, ran his own partial spot check, 20 items, randomly selected, and found no discrepancies, because there were no discrepancies, because I had counted 462 items with a signed verification, and done so correctly. We settled the billing dispute I had anticipated, which went my way on the reclassified items, and went his way on a minor discrepancy in the cable conduit subcategory that I conceded because he was right about it. He gave me the receipt, I gave him the cargo. He had heard about the inspection. Word moves fast on Kilo's station. The enforcement arm's administrative filings are technically internal, but the station registrar and the consignment broker have an information-sharing relationship that predates the administrative zone, as so many useful things around here do. He asked me, in the way that people who have heard a version of a story ask about it when they want to confirm whether the version they heard was accurate, whether it was true that I had made the fleet commander wait while I finished counting insulation bats. I was on item 214, I said. I couldn't stop there. He made a sound with his 4 arms that I have learned to read as restrained amusement, not laughter, which in his species is a full-body event and reserved for genuine occasions, but the smaller, quieter register of something recognized as genuinely absurd. Then he processed my payment and gave me the next consignment, a load of processed ore from the Kilo Station refinery, bound for the Saravathi Relay Clean Cargo Simple Manifest. 83 items. 83 items is a short count. On a good day, I can do 83 items in under 2 hours. 3 weeks after the Kilozam incident, I received a formal communication from the Quorathi Regional Authority, not the enforcement arm, but the civil administrative body, which is a different thing, and in my experience a more careful one, informing me that a jurisdictional review had been completed regarding Emergency Directive 774, and its applicability to vessels with current valid docking registrations at Kilozam Way Station. The review had determined that the directive's language, as written, did not encompass docked vessels in valid registered bays. The directive had been amended. In the amended version, docked vessels with current docking registrations are explicitly exempted. The language is clear and unambiguous. It names kilos ohm specifically, and by extension applies to any way station within the zone whose docking registration system is recognized under the pre-zone transit framework. They sent me a copy of the amended directive. They did not include a note. They did not acknowledge the incident. They did not acknowledge that the exemption language had been prompted by a cargo runner on item 214 who had declined to stand down because she was busy, or that the outcome had been determined not by anything she planned, but by a grid registration she had made 3 days earlier as a routine precaution, and hadn't bothered to cancel because she hadn't left yet. They did not need to acknowledge any of it. I can read a directive amendment. I filed the copy. I noted the date. I added the amendment language to my transit reference folder, which I maintain on a dedicated drive and update every 2 months, because transit law in the Quorathi administrative zone changes with enough frequency that a document that was accurate in the spring is a different document by autumn, and the only reliable protection against that is knowing the current version. Then I went back to work. I had a count to run. The Saravathi relay consignment was 83 items, as I said. Clean manifest, processed ore, sealed containers, uniform labeling. The kind of load where the count takes under 2 hours, the verification is straightforward, and the only ambiguity is whether the seal codes on the containers match the bill of lading, which they did. I was done by midday. I closed the bay. I poured myself a coffee. I updated my transit reference folder with the amended directive language. I filed the docking registration at Thessamery, where I was making a 2-day layover standard precaution, cargo protection grid option included, because it takes 45 minutes and a small deposit, and I do not leave bonded cargo in an unsecured bay. The docking confirmation came back clean. The grid registration went through on the first submission. Quorathi Kim signed off on the registration herself. She sent a brief note with the confirmation, which she does not do for everyone. I know this because I have talked to other runners who use Thessamery, and none of them have received notes from the registrar. She sends notes to people she considers worth noting, which is a form of precision I find appropriate. The note said, "Word got to us about kilos ohm. We updated our own grid documentation to include the amended directive language. Good counting." I read the note twice. I thought about Quorathi Kim behind her desk, under the charter on the wall with its small independent light, reading whatever account had reached the Brennan corridor about a cargo runner who was on item 214 and didn't want to lose her place. I thought about what she had found in that account worth noting, not the grid, not the fleet, but the count. Good counting. That is about the right way to put it. I filed the note in the same folder as the amended directive. Outside the viewport, Thessamery's running lights were coming on in the late cycle shift, the station's interior beginning the gentle dim-to-warm that marks the end of the main administrative period, the beginning of the quieter hours when the paperwork thins out, and the corridors carry only the soft background noise of a station doing what it was built to do. A hauler twice the size of Garrett's margin was easing into the approach corridor, with the patient precision of a large vessel that has made this approach many times and has no reason to hurry. I watched it come in. I thought about the Saravathi ore count, 83 items, clean, done, and about the next consignment after that, which I had not yet been assigned but which the broker at Kilos had indicated would be coming out of the station's surplus materials inventory. Surplus materials, in my experience, means a bulk load with a complicated manifest and at least one reclassification argument built into it. Maybe 200 items. Maybe more, depending on how the categories had been consolidated by whoever loaded it. Something to look forward to, in the way that a problem you know how to solve is something to look forward to. Not because it is easy, but because easy is not the point. The point is finishing. Good counting meant. I got to 214, I was interrupted. I waited for a natural stopping point. I got back to it, I finished. It meant I didn't lose my place. It meant I signed the verification before I agreed to anything else, because the verification was what I was there to do, and it needed to be done correctly, and nothing that came through the Bay Calm while I was doing it was more important than doing it correctly. Vethasar built a plan around a variable. The variable had something else to do. The Quorathi administrative zone has, by my count, amended 63 directives in the 6 years I have been working their corridors. Some of those amendments reflect policy changes. Some reflect legal challenges. Some reflect things that happened in the corridors. Situations the original directive language did not anticipate, handled in ways the original drafters did not model, with outcomes that required the language to be updated to account for what turned out to be possible. The count does not care what the model expected. The count is the count. It takes as long as it takes. When you are done, you sign it, and then you deal with whatever is waiting. I closed the viewport shade. I went to the galley. I put on a fresh pot. The next manifest would be there in the morning.